Christmas Eve wrapped the house in a silence heavy enough to crush the heart. I sat alone in the living room, shadows stretching from the flickering Christmas tree lights, filling the room with cold loneliness. Each ornament held a memory of better times, when laughter filled every corner and warmth wrapped around us like a blanket. Now the quiet pressed against me, sharper than the December chill outside. I absently traced a crack on the wooden armrest where Maria once rested her hand. The fire sputtered, sending fleeting warmth too weak to chase away the weight inside me. The phone rang, a sudden scratch that shattered the stillness. Seeing Greg's name blink on the screen sparked a faint hope. Maybe, just maybe, the family would come together tonight. I answered carefully. His voice was brief, lacking its usual warmth. "Dad, Elaine and I won't be there this Christmas. Her mother is unwell." No regret, no softness, just words like a door slamming shut. I forced myself to say, "I hope she gets better." But the call ended too soon, and so did my hope. The ache settled deep. This wasn't just a missed holiday. It was the widening gap between us. Years of sacrifices reduced to excuses. I closed my eyes and let the past flood over me. The nights I worked overtime to cover Greg's tuition. The countless times I refinanced houses, paid debts, and slipped unnoticed into the background while the others celebrated. Every sacrifice felt like a stone in a wall quickly crumbling beneath me. Then came the photos. Scrolling through my phone days later, I found them. Greg and Elaine, radiant beneath Hawaiian sun, their smiles carefree, oblivious to the ache they left behind. The betrayal tightened like a noose, raw and suffocating. They had traded their promise for paradise, leaving me alone in this house of fading echoes. Their images mocked the empty rooms and the loneliness Maria and I never imagined could settle here. I stared too long, the edges of the screen blurring as a cold fire kindled inside. I remembered all the times I juggled finances to keep the family afloat. The late nights reading balance sheets. The endless stream of bills I paid in silence. This house, built on years of patient devotion, had become a stage for their selfish farce. The silence around me grew heavier, filled with the ghosts of laughter and love lost. The ticking clock became a cruel metronome, marking each passing moment that I was no longer their provider, but a forgotten relic. The cold settled deep in my chest, and I clenched my fists to hold back the tremor of helplessness. Outside, the snow fell softly, white and indifferent. The world was alive with holiday cheer, but inside, I was frozen in an invisible prison of neglect. The man who had given everything was now a stranger to his own son. The betrayal was not loud or violent. It was a quiet severing, slow and unbearable. In that moment, sitting among the flickering lights and fading memories, I felt something fragile crack inside me. The patient father, the generous provider, was slipping away, replaced by a colder presence. A man who understood that some debts must be balanced, that some betrayals demand reckoning. Tonight was the beginning of a reckoning I'd long postponed. And so the house held its breath, waiting for the storm that I, quietly and deliberately, was preparing to unleash. After that final call, I found myself retreating to the quiet refuge of my study, a room thick with memories and the lingering scent of old leather and aged paper. The dim glow of the desk lamp cast long shadows while I sank into the familiar embrace of my worn leather chair. Here, away from the empty walls of the house, I could confront the unraveling threads of a life and family built on years of tireless effort and sacrifice. I let my thoughts drift to the countless nights I'd spent poring over financial documents, long after the rest of the world had gone to sleep. The bank statements, account ledgers, and spreadsheets had been as familiar as the faces of my loved ones. The weight of responsibility had settled on my shoulders early in my career. Balancing budgets, securing loans, maneuvering refinances. Each calculation carried the quiet hope that my efforts would create stability for those I cared for most. Remembering those times, I was struck by the magnitude of what I had given without hesitation. I recalled refinancing mortgages, cutting deals to lower interest rates so Greg could afford a home, working through nights filled with numbers instead of dreams. The tuition bill stacked higher every year, paid on time, no matter how tight the margins became. Maria's hopeful smile, reassuring me in the kitchen as I worked through expenses late into the night, underscored the shared burden we carried as parents. But the sacrifices extended far beyond money. There were missed vacations, simplest joys exchanged for the endless juggling of bills and late shifts. Birthdays passed with no celebration, dinners eaten alone, all swallowed by the need to maintain a foundation that appeared solid even as it felt increasingly fragile beneath my feet. The weight was invisible to most, worn quietly like a second skin. Now, as I traced the lines of these memories, the irony was bitter. The fortress I had built was crumbling from the inside. Those I had protected with every fiber of my being had grown distant and indifferent. Elaine's thinly veiled contempt, Greg's dismissive tones, they were not accidental fractures but deliberate neglect. The entitlement in their eyes was a stark contrast to the countless nights I spent ensuring their comfort at my own expense. The images of Greg and Elaine carefree in Hawaii haunted me. Their bright smiles and sun-kissed laughter contrasted violently with the cold, lonely rooms around me. They had traded the solemn duty of family for fleeting pleasure, abandoning the ties that should have held us together. These photos weren't just proof of deceit. They were a slap in the face, a public display of betrayal that no words could soften. As the minutes ticked away on the clock, its relentless rhythm became a cruel reminder of time lost and trust broken. The silence thickened like fog, heavy and suffocating, settling deep in my chest, a coldness that no fire could dissolve. Outside, the snow fell gently, serene and unfeeling, its softness at odds with the sharp ache that consumed me. The man who had given everything was becoming a stranger to his own blood. A quiet fracture spread within me. The patient father, the man who weathered storms with calm endurance, began to slip away. In his place arose a different presence, a cautious strategist who understood that debts must be settled, that betrayals carry consequences beyond mere words. This night was not an end but a beginning, the start of a reckoning I had long delayed. With clearer vision, I sifted through the layers of betrayal and neglect, drawing on decades of experience managing assets, balancing books, and uncovering hidden irregularities. Greg and Elaine's reckless disregard was no longer a vague suspicion, but a tangible pattern. I recalled whispers from mutual acquaintances about unauthorized withdrawals from the family trust, about financial missteps expertly concealed beneath layers of forged documents and false promises. I remembered my days at the bank when I trained myself to detect inconsistencies and irregularities with quiet precision. It was a skill born not of cynicism but of necessity. Today, it became my weapon. I began to map mental blueprints. Traces of debt, forged signatures, risky loans taken without authorization. Each a crack I could exploit to shatter the facade Greg and Elaine so carefully constructed. I considered the contacts I'd accumulated over my career. Auditors, legal advisors, compliance officers. They weren't just tools of a profession now long behind me. They were allies in a war I was about to wage. The plan was neither impulsive nor reckless. It was patient, meticulous, and above all deliberate. I would gather evidence, expose deceit, and restore what was lost. This was no moment for fury or bluster. It called for silence, for the calculated calm of a man who had spent a lifetime navigating the intricacies of finance and human nature alike. I felt the cold logic settle like steel in my veins. The personal wounds were deep, but this was not about vengeance. It was about justice, measured and exact. Maria's memory hovered, a gentle light amid the storm. She had believed in family,
in loyalty born not only from blood but from sacrifice. Her quiet courage had carried us through many trials, and now, in her absence, I was charged with carrying the torch.
The path was clear, even if difficult. As dawn crept shyly at the edges of the night, the fire burning within me did not waver. What had been a quiet house of shadows was transforming into a crucible of determination. The man who had suffered silence and betrayal was now a strategist, ready to act. Though the world beyond the windows buzzed unknowingly with holiday celebrations, I held to the certainty that a reckoning would come. I was no longer the forgiving father left behind. I was a sentinel poised to defend his legacy. The years of sacrifice would no longer be debts unpaid. The silent ledger of trust would be balanced, and with it, the scales of justice restored. So, in the stillness of that room filled with memories and ledgers, I quietly prepared for what was to come. The patient man I had been was changing, and from the ashes of betrayal, a force of calculated resolve rose, steady and unyielding. The night carried its breath, waiting for the storm I was ready to unleash. The weeks that followed were marked by a chilling transformation in my daily existence. The morning man, betrayed and cast aside, had given way to a quiet, icy determination. No longer was there room for despair or emotional tumult. Instead, I adopted the cold, analytical mindset of a seasoned banker examining a troubling irregularity. Methodical, precise, unwavering. It began with a phone call, casually placed, to an old acquaintance from my banking days, a compliance officer whose sharp eye and meticulous nature were renowned. Under the guise of routine inquiry, I asked about the family trust, probing for any anomalies without revealing my hand. The response was a murmur of concern. Financial movements inconsistent with past patterns, unauthorized disbursements that merited investigation. That confirmation was the spark that ignited my plan. I returned to the study with renewed purpose, assembling a trove of documents, bank statements, trust fund records, loan applications, and signatures that no longer matched the steady hand I expected. I pored over each detail with the patience of a sculptor revealing a form hidden in stone, eyes trained to spot the slightest deviation. The irregularities were tangible. Loans taken without authorization, signatures forged in haste and desperation, assets quietly siphoned off like water leaking from an unseen crack. The family trust, once a well-oiled machine safeguarding futures, was now an empire of shadows, built on deception and shrouded in falsehoods. But it wasn't just the documents that revealed the true picture. It was the pattern beneath them. The way Greg's debts piled higher, masked by creative bookkeeping. Elaine's increasing influence over financial decisions, undermining my efforts to maintain control. The calm facade they presented to the world was crumbling, just as I had suspected. Each phone call to my old contacts yielded small but critical insights. Discussions with auditors uncovered key breaches of fiduciary responsibility. Legal advisors hinted at strategies to freeze assets and force transparency. Piece by piece, a plan emerged. From the shadows, a framework built on law, finance, and unwavering resolve. I began to trace the flow of funds, following the digital trails and paper footprints. There were late payments on their part, excuses offered with shaky confidence, attempts to gloss over irregularities with fabricated stories that would have fooled a less vigilant eye. But I was trained to see beyond the surface, to dissect even the most carefully spun tales. The meticulousness of this process was exacting, taxing my patience and endurance. It was a far cry from the warmth of family dinners and shared holidays. But there was a grim satisfaction in knowing I controlled the pace and direction of this pursuit. Where I had once hoped for grace and gratitude, I now relied solely on tools honed from professional necessity. Every night, as the house settled into silence, I found solace in the order of columns and figures. The ledger of betrayal was tallied with ruthless precision. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. This was no mere familial rift, but a systematic exploitation of trust and authority. My thoughts often drifted to conversations long past, to subtle signs I had overlooked. The sly comments from Elaine during our brief meetings, masked with politeness but dripping with condescension. Greg's shifting explanations amid growing debts, his gaze avoiding mine when questions became too pointed. These were cracks, fractures in a facade I was now expertly pushing until it broke. Yet I maintained a calm exterior, even in the rare moments they attempted to confront me. Their faces betrayed disbelief as I refused to be dragged into heated arguments or emotional outbursts.
Instead, I met their accusations with measured replies, a steady voice that unraveled their defenses without rancor. This was warfare without guns or shouts, silent, relentless, and devastating. The walls of their comfortable lives began to feel the tremors. Bills piled up. Lenders grew suspicious. Their access to accounts tightened as legal notices quietly circulated. The comfortable illusion they had enjoyed was cracking under the weight of evidence and strategy. I watched as the arrogance in Greg's eyes flickered and waned, replaced by desperation concealed behind false bravado. Elaine's usual smirks faded to tight-lipped lines. They scrambled to maintain control, but the foundation they trusted so blindly was eroding beneath their feet, and there was nowhere left to run. In the solitude of my study, I found a grim peace amid the storm. This was no longer about pain or betrayal. It was about justice delivered with the precision only years of discipline could afford. I had planned each move carefully, waiting for the right moment rather than rushing headlong into confrontation. The power had shifted. No longer the victim in their eyes, I became the arbiter of balance and consequence. The quiet vengeance of a man who had measured every penny and now measured every step of retribution. As days stretched into weeks, the plan solidified. Legal avenues to freeze assets, audits to expose forged documents, and gatherings with advisors to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. Behind every calculated recommendation was the story of a father betrayed, patient no more. Though the manipulation still stung like fresh wounds, it was tempered now by certainty and control. Every discovery was a small victory, a step toward reclaiming what had been slyly taken. My presence was no longer one of silent suffering, but of deliberate action, quiet but impossible to ignore. The house still held its breath. But I was no longer waiting for a storm. I was the storm gathering, slow and inexorable. The balance would be restored, the arrogance punished, and the ledger of trust, once so carelessly destroyed, finally set straight. Tonight, I could almost hear the first crack in their fragile empire, small and subtle, but unmistakable. The reckoning had begun, and there was no turning back. The weeks that unfolded after the first decisive steps of my plan passed with a relentless, steady purpose. The study, once a quiet retreat of memories and faded hopes, transformed into a command center where the gears of justice turned with calculated precision. Every inch of that small room, stained papers, scattered ledgers, the dull weight of unopened envelopes, bore witness to the war being waged silently but decisively. I was no longer the betrayed father. I was the strategist, the sentinel of truth, and every day I grew more resolute. Preserve the original language of the mountain of financial evidence painstakingly collected, turning over every document with a scrutiny honed by decades of disciplined work. Bank statements, trust fund ledgers, transfer records, loan agreements. Each piece was more than numbers. They were the story of betrayal hidden in ink and paper. Some entries revealed subtle deviations, transactions carefully trimmed below reporting thresholds or cleverly concealed transfers. Others shouted in their brazenness, forged signatures that twisted familiar handwriting into deception, unauthorized loans funded without consent, assets slipping quietly away into unfamiliar hands. It was a chilling revelation just how calculated Greg and Elaine's treachery had become. Their greed was no mistake, but a deliberate scheme woven tightly into the fabric of family trust and expectation. They had ensnared themselves in a web of lies, shielding their actions behind smiles and false promises.
Thinking the foundations I built would never quake. But every woven thread has a weak point, and my task was to find and pull each one until their empire unraveled with no hope of repair. The contacts I had cultivated over a lifetime in finance, meticulous auditors, sharp-eyed legal advisors, and skilled forensic accountants, stood with me now as allies in this quiet war. I reached out with care, careful not to give away the depth of my intent too soon. Their expertise turned clouds of suspicion into clear skies of facts, facts that could no longer be ignored or disputed. Their reports arrived in steady streams, each a piece of a puzzle that I assembled with relentless determination. Forged documents emerged from the shadows, contracts breached, loans falsely authorized. Greg's debts, masked for so long under layers of falsified accounts, were laid bare. Elaine's hidden influence and control over financial decisions, once veiled behind charm and family politics,
became glaring and undeniable. The plan took shape with the precision of an architect drafting blueprints for demolition and reconstruction. First, assets tied to the family trust had to be frozen, halting the ongoing drain and preventing any last-minute shifts that might place resources beyond reach. Next, formal audits were initiated to expose the full scope of violations. Subtlety was paramount. Premature discovery would alert the culprits, possibly leading to the destruction of evidence or attempts to liquidate assets. Legal counsel prepared the necessary injunctions and motions, executing them with the professionalism and rigor that discrimination and arrogance demand. Each act was backed by unassailable evidence, turning every legal step into a hammer blow against their crumbling facade. Their reaction was immediate and telling. Greg's smugness, it had held for so long, shattered slowly as the consequences of his recklessness closed in. I saw the panic flicker in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw as once firm ground shifted beneath him. Elaine's smirks, once so assured, disappeared, replaced by forced calm and sharp whispers with lawyers. They scrambled to regain control, but their foundation, built on deceit and entitlement, was eroding fast, and nowhere provided refuge. Communication between us became a tightrope walk of veiled threats and cold warnings. Their attempts at intimidation met with my steady, measured responses. Words carefully chosen to maintain control, never to inflame. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me rattle. Every exchange was a calculated play in a long game where patience was my shield. Financial pressures mounted visibly. Bills accumulated, creditors grew wary, and their once commanding presence diminished. Their comfortable world, built on manipulation and borrowed trust, was giving way beneath relentless scrutiny. Amid this campaign, I found a bittersweet sense of peace. The path was draining, loneliness cutting deep at times, but the clarity of purpose was invigorating. I was no longer the man crushed by betrayal. I was the force restoring order, embracing the challenge with a resolve forged in years of discipline. The nature of this struggle was as much psychological as it was fiscal. Breaking their confidence, eroding their illusions of invulnerability, was as critical as exposing financial improprieties. I had become an unseen shadow in their lives, a constant, inevitable reckoning looming just beyond reach. One by one, legal tools took effect. Audit reports arrived, stripping away falsehoods. Assets froze, accounts locked, and demands for transparent accounting turned their world upside down. Creditors reconsidered their alliances as the threat of exposure loomed. Walls closed in, inexorably, as their empire fractured and weakened. Yet amidst this, I never lost sight of the personal cost. The weight of sleepless nights, the strain of sustained focus,
The memories of love and loss, each pressed heavily on me. Still, these sacrifices fueled my conviction. Maria's steady belief in family loyalty guided me. The fight was as much for her memory as for justice itself. My role had transformed completely, from man betrayed and abandoned to measured tactician, orchestrating a slow unmaking of lies. The final stages, approaching on the legal horizon, promised confrontation and reckoning. I was ready. In still moments, I traced the trajectory of this quiet storm. The documents amassed, the calls made, the plans executed, and saw justice rising inexorably like the tide. The arrogance that once cast me aside would be broken, the ledger balanced, and the family legacy reclaimed. Tonight I sensed it, an almost imperceptible crack appearing in their carefully constructed fortress. It was the first tangible sign of collapse, growing louder with every calculated step. There was no turning back. The storm amassed with a slow, sure force. I was prepared to unleash it. The day I began to shut down their access formalized a turning point I had long awaited, yet bore with the calm purpose born of experience and enduring pain. No longer was I the man crushed beneath layers of betrayal and silence. I was now the strategist, the unwavering agent of consequence. Each move was deliberate, every action steeped in the weight of years spent preparing for this moment. I knew, as well as I knew my own name, that the path would be slow, meticulous, and exacting, but relentless all the same. Working closely with my legal counsel and trusted financial advisors, I initiated the formal freezes on the accounts tied to the family trust. The floodgates of unauthorized spending shut with quiet efficiency. Prepaid cards blocked, transfer privileges revoked, and the revolving door of reckless disbursement slammed firmly closed. The banks complied smoothly, their actions cloaked in the dignity of law. Yet every signature and order carried a finality that set the course unmistakably. I knew Greg and Elaine would detect these changes swiftly. They had run too freely for far too long. Now the lifeblood of their careless excesses was cut. Shortly thereafter, Elaine called. Her voice was sweet, smooth, and practiced mask hiding a brittle urgency not unlike ice cracking beneath a thin snow cover. "Harold," she said, "what is this? We have bills that can't wait, expenses that are emergencies." I kept my voice steady, cool with layers of hidden anger barely restrained. "Elaine, from now on, every expenditure requires thorough documentation and formal approval. Emergencies must fall within strict guidelines and be scarce, not a way to continue unchecked spending." Her tone wavered, a crack betraying the confident facade. But I softened nothing, no more leniency, no more turning a blind eye. Greg's phone calls arrived next, his old arrogance stripped thin under the weight of reality. There was a desperation in his voice, half pleading, half outrage. "Dad, you don't understand what it's like out here. The pressure is enormous. You're making it worse." I met his frustration with calm resolve, every word deliberate. "Greg, responsibility replaces recklessness. This cannot continue. You gambled with our trust and resources. You must now face the consequences." Their veiled threats escalated as frustration boiled over, but I did not respond with rage or panic. Instead, each reply was composed and precise. I refused to be baited into futile arguments or emotional spirals. This battle was waged with the unyielding logic of law and financial scrutiny, not with shouting or threats. Meanwhile, the legal operations surged forward like a well-tuned engine. Formal audits were imposed, demanded with ironclad authority, which forced Greg and Elaine to comply, however reluctantly. Their carefully doctored financial records and ledgers, long relied upon as shields, unraveled quickly under the weight of expert forensic examination. False entries were exposed, forged paperwork laid bare. The cracks in their stories widened daily. Information filtered through the circle of creditors and business associates. Past discretion evaporated as overdue and unpaid bills mounted. Demands for payment became insistently loud. I watched as creditors who had once been complicit or indifferent shifted to suspicion and cautious withdrawal. The stability Greg and Elaine had taken for granted began to collapse beneath mounting pressure. I pictured the tension in the closed doors of their home, the storm of voices, the frantic attempts to plug financial leaks that were growing too wide. I was no longer a distant observer thrown aside by their entitlement. I was the central force dismantling their lives piece by piece. Elaine's calls grew more insistent, now tinged with fear. One evening, her voice trembled as she warned, "This could destroy us all."
I met that with unrelenting clarity. This is not destruction, Heather. It is correction, restoration. Broken trust must be mended by justice, no matter how hard. Greg escalated his efforts last, appearing at my home with flushed anger and veiled appeals. "Dad," he said, almost pleading, this has to end. There must be another way. We can fix this before it all falls apart." His eyes flickered with a flicker of genuine remorse beneath layers of bravado. I met his gaze steadily. "Your chance to make things right vanished when you betrayed our trust. Now accountability is the only path." Through every difficult encounter, my composure did not waver. I spoke with the quiet strength of a man whose patience had hardened into steel. No impulsive bitterness, no desperate entreaties, only facts and measured consequence. I understood that throwing fire into their flames would only fuel recklessness. Instead, cold, calculated action was the only course. Behind the scenes,
I doubled down on legal protections. Asset freezes were extended, suspicious accounts scrutinized, transfers traced, reversed where possible. No corner was left unexamined. No opportunity for illicit escape left unblocked. Methodically, every back door was sealed. The toll on Greg and Elaine became painfully apparent. Their empire, once built on fantasy and false promises, now faced a relentless siege from which there was no retreat. Piles of overdue bills, legal warnings, the slow withdrawal of financial favors compounded their desperation, cracking their veneer of control. Emotionally, the process exhausted me. The nights grew long. The strain of sustained vigilance weighed heavily. Still, within, a fire burned brighter, a sense of purpose that elevated me beyond grief or resentment. Maria's belief in fidelity and family lent me strength. This fight was as much for her memory as for reclaiming a stolen legacy. At a late hour one evening, the senior auditor's voice on the phone was steely but tinged with urgency. "Harold, what we have uncovered will shatter their defenses in court. Forged signatures, unauthorized loans, incredible amounts moved illicitly. This is a case no judge can overlook." That confirmation, hard-won and earned, steeled my resolve anew. The crumbling accelerated rapidly. Greg's once unshakable confidence eroded. Desperation began to color his every move. Elaine's grip slackened in the face of mounting pressure and looming exposure. The reality of collapse was no longer distant. It encroached with brutal finality. At home, the house seemed to hold its breath. The silence was thick with tension, but beneath it, embers of resolve glowed firm. This was no longer about forgiveness or second chances. It was about justice, balance, and the restoration of a legacy nearly torn asunder. The cracks were no longer subtle. The fractures were now unmistakable, spreading wide and deep. The ledger, once fractured and ravaged, began to be rewritten with clarity and strength. The storm that I had once felt brewing was now here, not a distant threat, but a force of change, deliberate and relentless. Every step I took was a measured crescendo towards a reckoning long overdue. The weight of years, the sacrifice, the careful planning, all converged in these moments. The arrogance that had cast me aside would be broken. The scales of justice would be balanced at last. I was no longer waiting for the storm. I was the storm, patient, precise, unyielding, and I was prepared to unleash it. The day of the family trust hearing arrived quietly, weighted with an unspoken gravity that filled the courtroom with a somber stillness. The light filtered softly through tall windows, casting muted shadows over polished wood and the serious faces etched with years of responsibility and fatigue. I entered with the calm precision of a man who had long carried the burden of sacrifice, betrayal, and steadfast resolve. I was no longer merely a father, quietly wounded and sidelined, but a force of measured justice, tempered by patience and hard-earned wisdom. Sitting before the judge, I gathered my strength and allowed the memories to surface, the decades of tireless devotion, unseen sacrifices, and unwavering commitment to family. I spoke deliberately, each word a thread woven into the tapestry of truth. I recounted how I had quietly financed Greg's education, worked endless nights to refinance homes, paid debts that no others noticed. My voice, steady and free of bitterness, carried the weight of love and loss carried over a lifetime. This was my story, one embroidered with patience and hope. Then I shifted to the undeniable facts. With methodical clarity, I presented the mountain of evidence. Bank statements that chronicled unauthorized withdrawals, loans forged without consent, and countless transactions that betrayed trust. Each document was a testament to deception, a calculated betrayal masked by false smiles. I delivered the facts not with venom, but with the measured tone of a man exposing what could no longer be hidden. Across the courtroom, Greg and Elaine sat rigid, their composure unraveling with each revelation. The arrogance I had once seen in Greg's eyes waned, replaced by the pale, flickering light of dread and regret. Elaine's smug facade, once impenetrable, cracked under the weight of truth and scrutiny. I caught Greg's gaze briefly. An unspoken admission of defeat lay beneath the surface, a silent concession that their constructed world was collapsing around them. The judge, a pillar of impartiality and prudence, listened intently, asking pointed questions that I answered with calm precision. The weight of responsibility in his measured words affirmed the seriousness of the situation. Truth was unveiled not through drama, but through steadfast clarity. Every answer I gave chipped away at the facade, exposing the raw underpinnings of betrayal with inexorable logic. As the courtroom absorbed the evidence, the atmosphere thickened with solemn understanding. When the verdict was finally pronounced, it resonated with quiet finality. Accounts would remain frozen, fraudulent loans invalidated, and strict oversight imposed to safeguard the trust's future. There was no fanfare, no applause, only the deep, reverberating silence of justice wrought true. A profound stillness settled over me then. It was neither relief nor triumph, but something deeper, a restoration of dignity eroded through years of silent betrayal. My place, once diminished, was reclaimed in that measured pause of recognition. The whispers filled the halls as the courtroom emptied. Greg and Elaine departed, stripped not only of financial power, but confronted with the ruin their arrogance had wrought. Their reputations, carefully tended yet hollow, lay shattered before the steady light of truth. Outside, the indifferent world moved on, unaware of the quiet drama that had just unfolded. But for me, a chapter closed and a new beginning emerged. I stepped into the light of the day carrying a strength born not of vengeance, but of justice fulfilled. The weight of years lingered. Memories of Maria, of love freely given and now honored, framed every thought. The story I had told was more than numbers or breaches. It was a testament to loyalty, to the cost of betrayal, and the triumph of resilience. The lesson was harsh yet clear. Sacrifice is no invisible ledger to be squandered, and trust, once broken, demands restitution. Justice had been served, the balance restored, and the legacy Maria and I built was saved from ruin. As I walked away, the winter air felt like a cleansing breath, cool and fresh, yet alive with promise. The scars of the past remained, indelible beneath the surface, but they no longer defined me. I was free, dignified, victorious in the quietest, most profound way. The future was uncertain yet hopeful. The shattered ledger was rewritten, the family legacy guarded and preserved. And in that preservation lay a fragile seed of renewal, not born of bitterness, but nurtured by endurance, wisdom, and unwavering justice. I was no longer simply a man betrayed. I was a man vindicated, tempered in fire, and renewed in purpose. The legacy bore the marks of battle, but stood resolute, protected by patience, strategy, and love. That day I embraced peace, not born of forgetting or erasing pain, but forged through endurance and measured triumph. The storm had passed, leaving the sky clear for a new dawn. I walked forward in the calm light of justice fulfilled, ready to face whatever lay ahead, with steady steps and a heart tempered by resilience. Weeks later, the silence in the house had shifted from heavy and oppressive to calm and measured. A softness that settled like a gentle tide over memories both painful and precious. The rooms, which had once echoed with betrayal and absence, now cushioned my footsteps. The quiet no longer a reminder of loss, but a canvas for renewal. I moved through the spaces that Maria and I had built with quiet appreciation, each corner holding echoes of laughter, resilience, and love that had endured even the harshest storms. Outside the windows, life carried on with indifferent rhythm. Neighbors' laughter, distant sounds of daily bustle, the change of seasons, these continued unperturbed, unaware of the battle that had unfolded behind my doors. Yet, inside me, a chapter had closed with deliberate finality. I was no longer the man crushed beneath the weight of broken trust. I had emerged tempered by trial, refined by persistence, and renewed by justice served. The passage of time softened the sharper edges of grief, but did not diminish the weight of remembrance. Preserve the original language of moments, her steadfast belief in family and fidelity a beacon I carried forward. The sacrifices we had made, the missed celebrations, the silent prayers, the unspoken support, were threads woven indelibly into the fabric of my existence. I realized then that the story I had recounted in that courtroom was not just one of financial betrayal, but a testimony to loyalty and the cost exacted by those who take without care. The lesson was stark and unforgiving. Sacrifice is not a ledger that can be recklessly written off. It is a trust bestowed that demands respect and careful labor. When that trust was fractured and disregarded, restitution was not just necessary, it was imperative. What had been lost financially pales beside the deeper injury of broken bonds and shattered faith. Yet justice had prevailed. The scales, once tipped cruelly by greed and entitlement, had been balanced. The legacy Maria and I built, fragile and weathered, had been salvaged from ruin, preserved against the eroding tide of disregard. This was no small victory. It was a reclamation of dignity that defied the shadows cast by betrayal. As I stepped outside into cold air bracing with the purity of winter's breath, a sense of cleansing passed over me. The chill was invigorating, stirring a calm clarity within. Although the scars of the past remained etched beneath the surface, they no longer held dominion over my spirit. The weight lifted, replaced by a quiet dignity born of endurance and triumph. I was free, not in reckless jubilation, but in the deepest and most profound way of true survival. The path ahead, though uncharted and uncertain, was walked with steady confidence. The shattered ledger of trust had been rewritten with clarity and strength. The legacy that endured was not one of unblemished perfection, but of steadfast resolve and unyielding care. The path ahead, though uncharted and uncertain, was walked with steady confidence. The shattered ledger of trust had been rewritten with clarity and strength. The legacy that endured was not one of unblemished perfection, but of steadfast resolve and unyielding care. In its preservation lay a tentative hope, a seedling nurtured not by bitterness or vengeance, but by hard-won wisdom and unwavering justice. I was no longer defined solely by the pain of betrayal. I was a man vindicated, tempered in fire and battle-hardened with purpose. The scars marked me, yes, but they also bore witness to survival, to lessons learned, and to the love that anchored me through years of storm and solitude. The legacy stood firm, guarded by the lessons of patience, strategic resolve, and a love that had outlasted despair. In that moment, I embraced peace. Not the peace of forgetting or the dulling of wounds, but the peace born of endurance, of measured triumph against odds that once seemed insurmountable. The storm that had once threatened to consume all had passed, leaving behind clear skies, an invitation to renewal and quiet strength. I walked forward beneath that open sky, heart steady and eyes clear. Justice had been fulfilled, dignity restored, and the future lay before me, unknown but embraced with steadfast courage and calm resolve. The journey had been long and hard, but in every step I had reclaimed not only what was lost, but the very essence of who I was. And in that reclaiming, I found a hope so deep it promised endurance. Hope that the legacy I safeguarded might one day grow beyond the shadows, guided by the lessons etched into every beat of my resilient heart.